On a frigid December morning in 1917, just weeks after the Bolshevik Revolution, Vladimir Lenin signed a decree establishing the Cheka, the first Soviet state security organization. Led by Felix Dzerzhinsky, known as Iron Felix, this new security force operated from the imposing Lubyanka building in central Moscow, which would later become synonymous with interrogation and terror. This act, seemingly bureaucratic in nature, would lay the groundwork for one of history's most extensive systems of forced labor and political repression. The Soviet Gulag, an acronym for Main Administration of Camps, would eventually spread across the Soviet landscape like a vast archipelago, to borrow Solzhenitsyn's famous metaphor, forever altering millions of lives and the course of 20th century history. The origins of the Gulag system were rooted in the earliest days of Soviet power. Lenin, facing civil war and economic collapse, saw forced labor as both a practical necessity and ideological tool. "We must cleanse Russia for long," he wrote in 1918, authorizing the creation of the first concentration camps for unreliable elements. In August 1918, he telegraphed officials in Penza regarding a kulak uprising: hang without fail so the people see, no fewer than 100 known kulaks, rich men, parasites. These early camps, established during the Red Terror period, primarily housed political opponents, former Tsarist officials, and members of the bourgeoisie. The Kholmogory camp near Arkhangelsk became notorious for its extreme mortality rates, where hundreds of officers from Admiral Kolchak's White Army were executed in 1921. Unlike Stalin's later industrialized system, Lenin's camps were relatively small-scale and decentralized, though no less brutal in their treatment of prisoners. What began as expedient measures during wartime gradually evolved into a permanent feature of Soviet governance. By 1923, the Solovki prison camp, established in a former monastery on remote islands in the White Sea, became the prototype for future Gulag installations. Prisoner Dmitry Likhachev, later a famous cultural historian, recalled how monks' cells were converted to house dozens of inmates, while the island's isolation made escape virtually impossible. Here, Soviet authorities first tested the economic potential of forced labor while isolating political enemies in harsh conditions. One prisoner described Solovki as a place of no return, where inmates worked logging operations and construction projects while enduring extreme cold and systematic abuse. The camp commandant, Naftali Frenkel, pioneered the system of food rations tied to work output, a practice that would become standard throughout the Gulag and cause countless deaths. The Gulag's transformation from improvised prison camps to vast industrial complex came with Stalin's rise to power. The industrialization demands of the first 5-year plan created an insatiable need for labor in remote, resource-rich regions of the country. Stalin recognized that prisoners could simultaneously serve as workforce and political control mechanism. "We need the canal, and we need the people who build it to be reformed through labor," declared a propaganda slogan at the White Sea-Baltic Canal project, where thousands perished constructing a waterway of questionable utility but immense symbolic value. Maxim Gorky, the renowned writer, was brought to tour the canal in 1933 and subsequently edited a propaganda volume praising the reforging of criminals into Soviet citizens. Despite having witnessed emaciated prisoners collapsing from exhaustion, the canal, built almost entirely with primitive tools and human hands, became a showcase project celebrated in Soviet media even as more than 25,000 workers died during its construction. The economic motivation behind the Gulag's expansion cannot be overstated. By the mid-1930s, Gulag prisoners were mining gold in Kolyma, harvesting timber in Siberia, building railways across the tundra, and constructing factories in previously uninhabited regions. In the Kolyma region alone, prisoners extracted over 2,000 tons of gold between 1932 and 1940, providing crucial foreign currency for Soviet industrialization. The notorious Dalstroy Agency, led by Eduard Berzin until his own arrest in 1937, functioned as a colonial administration over an area the size of Western Europe. The NKVD, successor to the Cheka, became not just a security agency, but an economic enterprise with its own production quotas and industrial objectives. In 1940, Gulag labor accounted for approximately 15% of all Soviet construction work. Vorkuta's coal mines, Norilsk's nickel production, and Magadan's gold fields, all cities built by and for prisoners, became industrial centers powered by human suffering. Yet economics alone cannot explain the Gulag phenomenon. The system served as the ultimate enforcement mechanism for Stalin's political vision. The infamous Article 58 of the Soviet Criminal Code, introduced in 1927 and expanded in 1934, created the legal framework for mass arrests. Under its vague provisions against counter-revolutionary activities, anyone could be sentenced to the camps for offences as minor as an overheard joke or association with a suspected enemy of the people. Historian Roy Medvedev's father disappeared after questioning aspects of Lysenko's pseudoscientific biological theories, while rocket engineer Sergei Korolev, who later led the Soviet space program, spent years in the Gulag after being denounced by colleagues. Poet Anna Akhmatova captured the climate of fear. "They took away my son, they took away my husband, just so they could be tortured in prison cells." Indeed, her son Lev Gumilyov spent over a decade in camps, while her former husband Nikolai Gumilev had been executed in 1921. The Great Purge of 1936 to 1938 dramatically expanded the Gulag population. NKVD chief Nikolai Yedshov, the Bloody Dwarf, oversaw a period of unprecedented terror where arrest quotas were assigned to regions. In Moscow alone, 30,000 people were arrested in just 4 months of 1937. Many were convicted in perfunctory troika tribunals lasting mere minutes, with confessions often extracted through torture. Stalin personally signed 383 lists containing 43,768 names of prominent figures to be tried and executed. In the famous doctor's plot of the late Stalin era, prominent Jewish physicians were accused of plotting to assassinate Soviet leaders, presaging a potentially massive purge that was only averted by Stalin's death in 1953. The principle of collective responsibility meant entire families could be punished for one member's alleged crimes. During agricultural collectivization, wealthy peasants known as kulaks were liquidated as a class, with millions deported to special settlements administered by the Gulag. The Nadzino affair of 1933 represented one of the most horrific episodes, when 6,000 deportees were abandoned on an island in the Ob River in western Siberia with minimal supplies. By the time authorities returned a month later, over 4,000 had died, with reports of cannibalism among the survivors. One former kulak from Ukraine recalled, "They took everything, our grain, our animals, even the seeds for next year's planting. Then they took us." These special settlers lived under guard, but outside formal camp boundaries, providing labor for forestry and agriculture projects. By 1941, approximately 930,000 such settlers were living in exile, including entire families with children born into this status. Ethnic minorities faced particularly harsh treatment. Stalin's policy of deporting entire nationalities suspected of disloyalty led to mass relocations of Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, and other groups. In 1944, nearly 500,000 Chechens and Ingush were loaded onto freight trains and transported to Central Asia, with up to a third dying during the journey or in the immediate aftermath. Their homeland was literally erased from Soviet maps, with towns renamed and settlements razed. The writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn later described these ethnic deportations as genocide through exhaustion and exposure. The Crimean Tatars, deported en masse in May 1944, lost nearly half their population during and after relocation, and were only allowed to return to their homeland in the late 1980s. World War II further transformed the Gulag, as millions of Soviet POWs returning from German captivity were sent directly to camps on suspicion of collaboration or exposure to Western influence. In Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, residents who had survived the devastating 900-day siege were sometimes arrested upon liberation for anti-Soviet statements made during their suffering. A Red Army officer who survived German prison camps, only to be sentenced to 10 years in Kolyma, remarked, "Stalin considered us all traitors for surrendering, even those of us who were unconscious when captured." General Andrei Vlasov, who had been celebrated for defending Moscow before his capture and subsequent collaboration with Germans, was executed along with his officers in the Lubyanka's basement in 1946, exemplifying Stalin's unforgiving attitude toward POWs. By 1950, the Gulag reached its peak population of approximately 2.5 million inmates, with millions more living in exile settlements. The vast administrative apparatus had become a state within a state, with its own economy, transportation system, and culture. The notorious Vygash Island camp in the Arctic Circle, where prisoners mined lead and zinc in perpetual darkness during winter months, reported mortality rates exceeding 30% annually. Camp administrators received bonuses for exceeding production quotas, creating perverse incentives that prioritized output over human lives. The irony of the Gulag system lay in its economic inefficiency despite the exploitation of millions. Malnourished, poorly equipped prisoners working in extreme conditions could rarely match the productivity of free labor. The Salakard-Igarka Railway, nicknamed the Dead Road, consumed thousands of lives before being abandoned after Stalin's death, leaving hundreds of kilometers of tracks to rust in the tundra. As economist and former prisoner Lev Razgon noted, the camps consumed more resources than they produced, but this was irrelevant to a system that valued control above all else. Even Beria, who oversaw the Gulag system in its later years, privately acknowledged its economic failures while continuing to expand it for political purposes. Survival in the shadows, a brutal reality of daily life in the Soviet Gulag. At 4:30 a.m., the harsh ring of the camp bell would pierce the freezing Siberian air, jolting prisoners from their brief respite of sleep. Get up for work!" shouted the guards, as recalled by Varlam Shalamov in his Kolyma Tales. In the notorious Serpantinka camp in the Kolyma region, prisoners were sometimes awakened by guards throwing buckets of water on them, leaving them to work in freezing clothes throughout the day. This moment marked the beginning of another day of struggle in the vast network of Soviet labor camps where millions would live and die during Stalin's reign. As prisoner Jacques Rossi later wrote in his encyclopedic The Gulag Handbook, the day began not with sunrise, but with the rising of anger. The morning routine began with a head count, prisoners standing at attention regardless of weather conditions, which in places like Vorkuta or Norilsk could reach minus 50 degrees Celsius. At Norilsk, the northernmost camp in the system, polar nights meant these counts took place in complete darkness for weeks during winter. Evgenia Ginsburg, who survived 18 years in the Gulag system, described in Journey into the Whirlwind how prisoners would be forced to stand motionless in blizzards until every person was accounted for. If one prisoner was missing or miscounted, we might stand for hours while fingers and toes turned white with frostbite, she wrote. In the Burapolom camp near Gorky, prisoner Nina Gagan-Torn recalled watching as an elderly professor collapsed during one such count and was left to freeze while the tally continued. This bureaucratic ritual often became a form of collective punishment, with entire groups suffering for administrative errors. Breakfast, if it could be called that, consisted typically of watery gruel and a small ration of bread, approximately 300 grams for those meeting work quotas, less for those who failed. At Vyatlag, in the Kirov region, survivor Lev Kopelev described how the soup was so thin that prisoners called it dishwater with a memory of cabbage. The bread itself became a form of currency in camp life, with inmates carefully guarding their portions or trading them for protection or favors. Many developed rituals around their bread ration, as Polish prisoner Andrzej Watt described. We would slice it with thread into the thinnest possible pieces to make it last longer, creating the illusion of eating more. Olga Adamova-Sliosberg recalled how prisoners would run their fingers along the bottom of soup bowls, desperate to capture every possible calorie. The official Soviet provision standards were rarely met, and camp administrators regularly skimmed food supplies to sell on the black market or to reward informants and favorites. At Solovki, the first large-scale camp established in a former monastery, the administration's dining hall served meat and fresh vegetables, while prisoners subsisted on rotten fish and moldy bread. By 6 a.m., work brigades would be marched to their assignments, often traveling kilometers through snow or mud to reach remote work sites. At the Vorkuta coal mines, prisoners trudged 5 kilometers each way through Arctic winds so severe that special ropes were strung between buildings to prevent workers from being blown away and lost in snowdrifts. The labor was deliberately exhausting and frequently deadly. In the infamous Kolyma gold mines, prisoners hacked at permanently frozen ground with primitive tools, meeting impossible quotas or facing reduced rations. The geologist and prisoner Mikhail Rozanov noted that the techniques used would have been considered criminally inefficient in any normal mining operation, but efficiency wasn't the point. Exhaustion was. Alexander Dolgun, an American citizen imprisoned in the Gulag, described in his memoir how workers would sabotage each other's tools to ensure their own quota completion, as solidarity quickly dissolved under starvation conditions. At the Ukhta oil fields, prisoner Joseph Scholmer observed how those too weak to fulfill quotas would be assigned to the Weak Brigade, OKP, Odel Kulturnoi Pomoshchi, a cruel euphemism meaning Cultural Assistance Section, which invariably became a death sentence as rations were progressively reduced. The Soviet principle of Trudodin, workday units, meant that food allocations were directly tied to productivity, creating a vicious cycle where malnourished prisoners became progressively weaker and less able to meet the demands placed upon them. The workday officially lasted 10 hours, but often extended much longer. During the construction of the Belomor Canal, a project that claimed over 25,000 lives, guards would chalk quotas on prisoners' backs in the morning. Those who failed to meet them by nightfall were often left at the work site overnight. Gustav Herling, a Polish survivor, described in A World Apart how during the long Arctic summer, when darkness never fell, guards would extend shifts indefinitely, claiming it was still the same workday. At the Ozalag complex near Lake Baikal, prisoner John Noble remembered how the 10-hour shift was considered only the time actively working, not including the hours marching to and from work sites or waiting for tools. Only the harshest weather conditions would halt outdoor labor, and even then, as Solzhenitsyn noted in One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, work would be stopped only when the temperature dropped below -41 degrees Celsius, and even this rule was frequently ignored when production quotas fell behind. At the Magadan transit camp, former prisoner Eleanor Lipper recalled a guard's cynical joke, "Here we have only 2 seasons, winter and July." Living quarters offered little respite from the day's hardships. In most camps, prisoners were crowded into barracks designed for a fraction of their actual population. The standard norm in the 1930s was less than 2 square meters of space per prisoner, though actual conditions were often much worse. In Magadan transit camp, women described sleeping in shifts because there wasn't enough floor space for everyone to lie down simultaneously. At Kolyma's Butugichag uranium mine camp, where prisoners extracted radioactive ore without protection, the barracks were so overcrowded that Shalamov described inmates sleeping like sardines, inhaling each other's breath. Wooden bunks were typically shared by 2 or 3 inmates, with no mattresses or bedding beyond what prisoners could improvise from sacks or spare clothing. In the Karlag complex in Kazakhstan, Thomas Kisney documented how prisoners slept on bare planks even as temperatures inside unheated barracks dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, with frost accumulating on interior walls. Parasites were ubiquitous. Lice, bedbugs and fleas tormented inmates constantly, spreading typhus and other diseases through the weakened population. At Pechora camp, Edward Bucher recalled how the wooden barracks became so infested with bedbugs that they seemed to move on their own at night. Margaret Buber-Neumann, who experienced both Nazi and Soviet camps, observed that while German camps were designed for systematic extermination, Soviet facilities achieved similar results through calculated neglect. The Nazi camps killed quickly and efficiently, she wrote, while Soviet camps killed slowly and wastefully. Sanitation facilities were primitive or non-existent. Many camps had only open latrines, unusable during the coldest months when human waste froze immediately. At Norilsk, prisoner Leonid Finkelstein described how, during winter, excrement would pile up in corners of the barracks, only to create a horrific thaw when spring arrived. Prisoners often had no opportunity to wash for weeks or months. In the Kargopolag complex, there was one bathhouse for 30,000 prisoners, allowing each person a bath approximately once every 6 weeks. Janusz Bardach described in Man is Wolf to Man how after 3 months in a logging camp without bathing, his clothes had practically fused to his skin. At the Solikamsk camp in the Urals, prisoner Hava Volovich recalled how women would collect snow in their hands to wash their faces, their only hygiene for months at a time. The lack of hygiene contributed to epidemic diseases that periodically swept through the camps, particularly during the wartime years when medical supplies were even scarcer than usual. At Kolyma's Elgin women's camp, doctor and prisoner Nina Savoyeva documented how nearly 80% of inmates suffered from scurvy, with many losing their teeth within months of arrival. The psychological pressure was intensified by arbitrary rule changes and punishments. At the infamous Butyrka prison in Moscow, where many began their Gulag journey, interrogators used sleep deprivation so extensively that prisoners hallucinated after days of continuous questioning. Gustav Herrling described how camp authorities would periodically relocate prisoners who had adapted to certain conditions, forcing them to restart the adaptation process in new surroundings. At Kolyma's Svistoplias camp, prisoner Edward Bucher recounted how just as inmates had constructed insulation for their barracks, they were ordered to remove it all as an unauthorized modification. Guards randomly searched barracks, confiscating any small comforts prisoners had managed to accumulate. Even possessing a pencil stub could result in time in the punishment cell, kartzer, where prisoners would be kept on minimal rations in unheated isolation. At Vorkuta, the kartzer was a literal hole in the permafrost, where prisoners would be lowered and left in complete darkness. Eugenia Ginsberg described how the kartzer in winter was effectively a death sentence for many, as temperatures inside the uninsulated cells dropped well below freezing. She wrote of one woman who survived 9 days in the kartzer at Elgin camp by constantly moving and refusing to sit on the ice-covered floor. She had conquered death with the heat of her body and will. The cumulative effect of malnutrition, overwork, disease, and psychological trauma produced staggering mortality rates across the Gulag system. During the harshest periods, particularly 1932 to 1933, the height of Soviet famine, and 1941 to 1943, early war years, annual death rates in some camps exceeded 25%. The Karlag complex in Kazakhstan recorded losing nearly a third of its population during 1933, while at the Vorkuta coal mines, an estimated 28,000 prisoners died in 1942 to 1943 alone. At special camps like Ozalag and Steplag, established after World War II specifically for particularly dangerous political criminals, mortality sometimes reached Soviet security chief Lavrentiy Beria's cynically calculated acceptable loss target of 5% per month. Dalstroy's gold mining operations in Kolyma became known as the Pole of Cold and Cruelty, with mortality rates so high that entire work brigades disappeared within weeks of arrival. Former Kolyma prisoner Ayub Bagirov recalled that at the Dniprovsky mine, corpses would be stacked like firewood outside the barracks during winter, as the ground was too frozen for burial. Official Soviet statistics, finally released in the 1990s, confirmed what survivors had claimed. At least 1.6 million documented deaths occurred in the camps, with many more deaths unrecorded or occurring shortly after release. Historian Oleg Klevniuk discovered archives showing that during 1941 to 1943, When rations were at their lowest, some camps reported over 50% mortality in newly arrived transports. The reality of Gulag existence was perhaps best captured by former prisoner Isaac Vogelfanger, who wrote, "In the camps, we learned that humanity is a far more fragile thing than we had ever imagined, but also that even in the worst conditions, some spark remains that separates us from animals." At Magadan, prisoner Evfrosinia Kersnovskaya secretly created hundreds of drawings documenting camp life, which she hid and later recovered, creating one of the most powerful visual records of the Gulag experience. This spark of resistance, memory, and identity allowed some to emerge from the shadow of the camps to bear witness to a system designed to erase not just lives, but the very memory of those it consumed. As Varlam Shalamov wrote after his release from 17 years in Kolyma, "I was a witness to the tragedy of Russia, and I'll be a witness until my dying day." The silent terror inside the brutal punishment system of the Soviet Gulag. In the frozen expanse of Siberia, where winter temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Celsius, Varlam Shalamov once observed that the cold itself was a punishment that preceded all other punishments. Shalamov, who spent 17 years in the Kolyma camps, wrote in his Kolyma Tales that Kolyma was a place where the temperature could drop to 60 degrees below zero and prisoners were still sent to work. For the millions who endured the Soviet Gulag system between 1918 and 1960, this natural cruelty was merely the beginning of a sophisticated apparatus of torment, designed not only to extract labor, but to break the human spirit. Former Dolstoy commander Eduard Berzan once cynically remarked, "We need the prisoners' labor, not their deaths," though the system he helped create ensured both in abundance. The Kaza, a specialized solitary confinement cell, represented perhaps the most dreaded formal punishment in the Gulag arsenal. These unheated concrete boxes, often too small for prisoners to lie down, became instruments of slow torture during Siberian winters. Former prisoner Evgenia Ginsburg described her experience in a Kaza at Kolyma as death that never quite arrives. At Magadan's transit prison, the Kazas were notoriously built below ground level, where the permafrost ensured temperatures never rose above freezing, even in summer. Prisoners would be stripped to their undergarments before confinement, ensuring maximum exposure to the killing cold. Guards would occasionally spray water into these cells, creating ice chambers that pushed human endurance beyond its limits. At Perm 36, a particularly brutal innovation was the standing Kaza, a concrete tube where prisoners could neither sit nor lie down for the duration of their punishment. A standard sentence of 5 days in the Kaza during winter months frequently resulted in frostbite, pneumonia, or death. Polish survivor Gustaw Herling-Grudzinski noted that more men died from the Kaza than from all other causes combined at Kargopol. The rhythm of Gulag life was punctuated by the constant threat of violence. Beatings administered by guards or criminal prisoners, who often served as informal enforcers, were routine and methodical. At Vorkuta, in the late 1930s, a particular form of torture involved forcing inmates to stand perfectly still for 12-hour stretches. Those who swayed or collapsed received additional beatings. This tactic, which required no special equipment or formal authorization, exemplified the improvisational cruelty that flourished within the system. At Kolyma's Serpentinka camp, guard Andrei Boyakov gained notoriety for his human dominoes method, forcing a line of prisoners to stand at the edge of a ravine, then shooting the first one so his falling body would knock the others down to their deaths. As Margaret Buber-Neumann, who survived both Nazi and Soviet camps, observed, "The difference was that in Germany they killed you right away. In Russia, they let you die." Mock executions emerged as a psychological weapon of extraordinary potency. Prisoners would be removed from barracks at night, marched to execution spots, forced to dig their own graves, and then subjected to blank firing squads. The psychological devastation this inflicted was often permanent. Janusz Bardach, who survived such an ordeal at Kolyma in 1941, later wrote that he died that night, even though my heart continued beating. At Norilsk in 1938, NKVD commander Vasily Kluchnikov reportedly organized mass mock executions for up to 30 prisoners at once, using the same execution pits later filled with actual victims. These staged killings were particularly common during the Great Terror of 1937, when the line between mock and actual executions became desperately thin. As poet Anna Akhmatova, whose son Lev spent years in the Gulag, wrote, "I've learned how faces fall apart, how fear looks out from under eyelids." The system's psychological sophistication extended beyond direct physical cruelty. Camp authorities meticulously cultivated networks of informants known as shtukachi, who infiltrated prisoner communities. The knowledge that any conversation might be reported created an atmosphere of paranoia that severed social bonds. At Solovki, one of the first major camp complexes established in 1923, NKVD records indicate that as many as 1 in 5 prisoners might be informing on their fellows. This system not only provided intelligence to camp authorities, but served as a form of torture in itself, destroying the possibility of genuine human connection. In his memoir, Journey into the Whirlwind, Eugenia Ginsberg described how her camp section had 3 categories of informants: professionals who received better rations, volunteers seeking to earn favor, and the broken who informed after torture. Lev Razgon, another survivor chronicler, noted how at Ustvimlag, prisoners developed elaborate codes to communicate, speaking in truncated sentences that would be meaningless if reported out of context, a practice they called sheptalo, whisper speech. The practice of collective punishment reinforced this social dissolution. When one prisoner violated rules or failed to meet work quotas, entire barracks would suffer consequences. This turned prisoners against each other and created a self-policing environment where inmates enforced compliance through violence. At Norilsk in the late 1940s, this strategy reached its zenith when entire sections of the camp were deprived of food for 3 days after production targets were missed. The resulting fights among starving prisoners claimed almost as many lives as the starvation itself. Susanna Pechora, who survived Taishet camp, described how after one escape attempt in 1952, all 600 women in her barracks were forced to stand outside for 18 hours in minus 30 degrees Celsius temperatures, resulting in 27 deaths from exposure. Famous dissident Vladimir Bukovsky later summarized this tactic. The genius of the Soviet system was making prisoners enforce their own punishment. Running the gauntlet represented a particularly brutal form of public punishment. The offending prisoner would be forced to run between 2 rows of fellow inmates or guards, each required to strike the runner with sticks, belts, or fists. Those who refused to participate in administering this punishment would themselves be punished. This technique, documented extensively at Vorkutlag, served multiple purposes. It physically punished the offender, publicly humiliated them, and forced complicity from other prisoners, making everyone participants in the system of brutality. At Kengir camp in Kazakhstan, this punishment was refined into what prisoners called the corridor of death, a 100-meter pathway between barracks where the condemned would be beaten with iron bars and pipes, rather than merely fists. Nina Gargan-Torn, an ethnographer imprisoned at Temniki, recorded how one woman who survived the gauntlet had skin hanging from her back like wet laundry. In a particularly perverse innovation at Sevostlag, camp commander Ivan Nikishov instituted what was called the Circle of Shame, a rotating gauntlet where prisoners moved in circles, ensuring no one could strike with less than full force without being observed. Sleep deprivation emerged as another weapon that left no visible marks but steadily eroded sanity. The practice of extended interrogations, lasting days without sleep, began in Lubyanka prison, but spread throughout the Gulag. Gustav Herrling, who survived Kargopol camp, described how after 3 days without sleep, hallucinations began, and after 5, you would confess to killing your own mother if it meant you could close your eyes. At Solovki's infamous Sekirka punishment isolator, prisoners were forced to sit on narrow perches on a staircase day and night. Falling asleep meant tumbling down stone steps. Guards would employ various techniques to prevent sleep, from bright lights and noise to forcing prisoners to sit on narrow stools, where falling asleep meant falling to the concrete floor. Robert Conquest documented how at Sukhanovka prison, the conveyor method involved 3 shifts of interrogators working continuously while prisoners remained awake for days. Eugenia Ginsberg described the resulting condition as sleep starvation psychosis, where prisoners lost the ability to distinguish between reality and dreams. The human toll of this punishment regime manifested in epidemic rates of mental breakdown. Camp records from Kulak in Kazakhstan documented rates of self-inflicted deaths 20 times higher than in the general Soviet population. Methods were desperate and determined. Prisoners would throw themselves into machinery, onto electric fences, or swallow shards of glass. Perhaps most disturbing were the self-mutilations. Prisoners who severed their own fingers or hands to escape deadly work assignments, calculating that the punishment for self-mutilation might still offer better survival odds. At Kolyma's gold mines, a practice known as sukhoruki, dry hands, emerged. Men would deliberately freeze their hands until amputation was necessary. Elena Glinka, who served as a nurse at Bamlag, recorded treating over 400 self-mutilation cases in a single winter of 1938. As Lithuanian survivor Dalia Grinkevičiūtė wrote in her smuggled memoirs, "We discovered there were fates worse than death, and punishments beyond punishment." The sadism of guards formed another layer of this punishment ecosystem. While official policy dictated standardized punishments, the reality on the ground granted enormous discretionary power to individual guards. At Sevostlag in the early 1940s, one guard became notorious for forcing prisoners to stand barefoot on ice while reciting Soviet poetry. Those who forgot lines were beaten unconscious. At Bamlag, guard Antonina Makarova, later executed for war crimes, developed what prisoners called the butterfly game. She would place cigarettes between prisoners' fingers, then burn them down to the flesh. Such individualized torments flourished in a system with minimal oversight and a culture that dehumanized prisoners as enemies of the people. At Serpentinka, Commandant Nikolai Garanin personally shot so many prisoners that executions there became known as Garanization. As Varlam Shalamov observed, the need to inflict pain is its own psychological reward for certain personalities. The Gulag did not create sadists. It gave them employment. Whispers from the frozen silence, the unraveling of Stalin's prison empire. When Nikita Khrushchev stood before the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in February 1956, the hushed audience could scarcely believe their ears. In a speech lasting nearly 4 hours, Khrushchev systematically dismantled the cult of personality surrounding Joseph Stalin, exposing the brutal machinery of repression that had consumed millions of Soviet citizens. "It is impermissible and foreign to the spirit of Marxism-Leninism to elevate one person," Khrushchev declared, his words reverberating through a system built on precisely that elevation. The speech took place in a closed session at the Kremlin's Hall of Columns, the same venue where Stalin's body had lain in state just 3 years earlier, a symbolic shift that was not lost on those present. Many delegates were visibly shaken. Some reportedly fainted, while others wept openly as decades of unquestioning loyalty crumbled beneath the weight of revealed atrocities. The secret speech, as it came to be known, marked a pivotal moment in Soviet history and began the slow, complex process of dismantling the vast network of forced labor camps known as the Gulag. This system, which at its height encompassed over 476 camp complexes containing thousands of individual camps, had become the backbone of the Soviet economy and the primary instrument of political control. By the time of Stalin's death in 1953, approximately 18 million people had passed through these camps, with millions perishing from exhaustion, malnutrition, disease, and execution. The reforms began even before Khrushchev's speech. In the immediate aftermath of Stalin's death, Lavrentiy Beria, the feared head of the secret police, initiated a surprising amnesty decree that released over 1 million prisoners, though primarily those with short sentences for minor offenses. This first crack in the system revealed the new leadership's recognition that the Gulag had become economically unsustainable and increasingly difficult to justify ideologically. The March 27, 1953 amnesty, announced just weeks after Stalin's death, primarily affected non-political prisoners, pregnant women, and those with children. Anna Akhmatova, the celebrated poet whose son Lev Gumilyov had spent years in the camps, captured the moment's ambivalence. Now they're returning the souls to their bodies, just as they're returning names to the cities. But I stand in line behind hundreds of thousands, and no one will ever call out my name. Indeed, most political prisoners would need to wait for subsequent amnesties that followed Khrushchev's rise to power. Khrushchev's denunciation accelerated this process dramatically. His speech acknowledged grave perversions of Soviet laws, mass repressions, and acts of terror under Stalin's rule. By publicly condemning these abuses, he effectively delegitimized the entire apparatus of terror. The speech itself remained officially secret within the Soviet Union, yet its contents spread through whispers and samizdat publications, igniting hope among families of the repressed. Khrushchev specifically condemned the fabricated doctor's plot of 1953, which had accused prominent Jewish physicians of conspiring to assassinate Soviet leaders, and the Leningrad affair, which had decimated the city's party leadership. Perhaps most significantly, he rehabilitated many old Bolsheviks executed during the Great Purge of 1936, including figures like Nikolai Bukharin and Grigory Zinoviev, whose names had been unmentionable for decades. The formula "enemy of the people," Khrushchev declared, was specifically introduced for the purpose of physically annihilating such individuals. Following this watershed moment, special commissions began reviewing cases of political prisoners. Between 1954 and 1957, these commissions examined more than 500,000 cases, resulting in the rehabilitation of many victims and the release of thousands more from the camps. The rehabilitation process, however, was selective and politically calculated. Those deemed genuine enemies of the state remained convicted, while the system avoided addressing the fundamental injustice of the repressions themselves. The commissions, known as troikas, the same term used for the three-person panels that had originally sentenced many to the Gulag, traveled to remote camps to review cases on site. In Vorkuta, a notorious coal mining camp complex beyond the Arctic Circle, the commission's arrival in 1956 sparked hopes that quickly turned to despair for many whose rehabilitations were denied. As one prisoner later recalled, they came to rewrite history, not to acknowledge it. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose monumental work, The Gulag Archipelago, would later expose the full horror of the camp system to the world, was among those released during this period. Arrested for criticizing Stalin in private correspondence, Solzhenitsyn had spent 8 years in the camps before his rehabilitation in 1957. His experience reflected the arbitrariness of Soviet justice and the capricious nature of rehabilitation. In his Nobel lecture, Solzhenitsyn would later assert, "One word of truth outweighs the whole world," a principle that guided his meticulous documentation of the Gulag system. His fellow camp survivor and chronicler, Varlam Shalamov, described the system's purpose more bluntly. The camps were created not for punishment, but for annihilation. The dismantling of the Gulag system transformed not only the physical landscape of the Soviet Union, but also its psychological terrain. Millions of former prisoners returned to society, carrying with them stories of unspeakable suffering and resilience. In cities across the Soviet Union, communal apartments became sites of whispered testimonies as families reunited with those they had presumed dead. The writer, Varlam Shalamov, who survived 17 years in the Kolyma camps, expressed the difficulty of this reintegration. "I had the constant feeling that I'd brought back from the camps some secret knowledge of life and death that others didn't have." Eugenia Ginsburg, author of the memoir Journey into the Whirlwind, described returning to Moscow after 18 years in the camps and exile. "I felt like a ghost walking through streets where I had once been alive." Many returnees discovered their homes occupied by others, their possessions distributed, and their places in society filled. They were living anachronisms in a country eager to move forward. By 1960, most of the large labor camps had been officially disbanded, though the system of political imprisonment continued in modified forms. The economic function of the Gulag was gradually replaced by civilian labor, while its punitive function evolved into a more targeted system of repression focused on dissidents and activists. The massive industrial projects built on prisoner labor, the White Sea-Baltic Canal, the mining operations of Kolyma, the cities of the far north, remained as physical monuments to this era, though their origins were seldom acknowledged officially. The canal, completed in 1933 at the cost of around 25,000 lives, was celebrated in Soviet propaganda as a triumph of socialist construction, even as its shallow depth rendered it nearly useless for its intended purpose. Magadan, once the gateway to Kolyma's deadly gold mines, transformed into a regular Soviet city, though local residents still referred to certain neighborhoods by their former camp designations. The reform process, significant as it was, remained deeply contradictory. While acknowledging Stalin's excesses, the Soviet leadership was careful not to undermine the legitimacy of the communist system itself. Khrushchev himself had been complicit in the terror, signing execution lists during his time as party boss in Ukraine. This fundamental contradiction, condemning the crimes while preserving the system that enabled them, created a fraught relationship with historical memory that persists in Russia today. In a telling episode that captured this ambivalence, Khrushchev visited the Novodevichy cemetery in 1961 and, upon seeing Stalin's grave monument with its lifelike bust, reportedly ordered it replaced with a more modest marker. The poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko captured the mood of this period in his famous poem The Heirs of Stalin, warning, "While the heirs of Stalin walk this earth, Stalin, I fancy, still lurks in the mausoleum." The Soviet collapse in 1991 briefly opened new possibilities for confronting this troubled past. Archives were partially opened, memorials were established, and organizations like Memorial emerged to document the repression and honor its victims. Founded in 1989 with the support of Andrei Sakharov, Memorial became the principal organization dedicated to researching political repressions in the Soviet Union and advocating for human rights in post-Soviet Russia. The opening of previously sealed archives revealed shocking documents, including Stalin's personal signature on execution lists authorizing the deaths of thousands. In the Katyn forest near Smolensk, excavations confirmed what had long been denied: the 1940 NKVD execution of around 22,000 Polish military officers and intellectuals. President Boris Yeltsin knelt at the site in 1992, offering a symbolic apology that would have been unthinkable during Soviet times. In the remote Solovetsky Islands, site of one of the first and most notorious camps, a monument was erected bearing the simple inscription, "To the victims of repression." Similar memorials appeared across the former Soviet space, from the Mask of Sorrow in Magadan to the small stone from the Solovki camp placed in Lubyanka Square in Moscow. These physical markers represented attempts to anchor the abstract horror of mass repression in concrete memory. The Wall of Grief, unveiled in Moscow in 2017, became Russia's first national monument to victims of political repression. Yet as Russia entered the 21st century, this brief period of reckoning gave way to a more ambivalent relationship with the Gulag's legacy. Under Vladimir Putin's leadership, a renewed emphasis on national pride and state power has complicated efforts to fully acknowledge the Soviet past. In 2021, Memorial was forcibly dissolved by Russian authorities, accused of violating the Foreign Agent Law. This action against Russia's most significant human rights organization signaled an official resistance to confronting the darkest chapters of Soviet history. Historian Yuri Dmitriev, who had discovered mass graves from the Great Terror near Karelia's Sandarmokh forest, was imprisoned on controversial charges widely seen as politically motivated. "The state fears memory," observed Arseny Rudzinsky, Memorial's late chairman, "because memory is the foundation of responsibility." Today, The physical remnants of the Gulag system are largely vanishing. Remote campsites are reclaimed by the taiga, wooden barracks collapse under the weight of Arctic winters, and the human witnesses to these events pass away. As the snow falls on abandoned watchtowers and rusted barbed wire, we're left with the echoes of 20 million voices that once filled these frozen wastelands. Remember Varlam Shalamov, who after 17 years in Kolyma wrote that a human being survives by his ability to forget. Or Eugenia Ginsburg, who returned to Moscow like a ghost walking through streets where I had once been alive. As we leave behind these monuments to human cruelty and resilience, we carry forward a responsibility to ensure that the silence of the taiga never completely swallows their stories. Until next time, this has been a journey through history's darkest corridors. May we never forget what happened here.